Okay. Okay. All right. Hello. Sorry for the delay. We have an exciting presentation coming up next. And I was really inspired by the words during the opening from Chris and from Christina. Chris telling us to make sure we're not staying on the fence on these critical issues. And Christina talking about how we have a society where we are in a shadow of racism and colonialism. This next presentation is about disrupting colonization in our classrooms. You'll be hearing from two people, Tricia Ebarvia and Christie Nold. Tricia is an expert in adolescent literacy with a focus on inclusive, student-centered practices through reading and writing workshops. She is currently an English teacher in Pennsylvania, where she began teaching after receiving her master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in 2001. Tricia is also the co-founder of Disrupt Text, a crowdsourced grassroots effort by teachers for teachers to challenge the traditional canon in order to create a more inclusive, representative, and equitable language arts curriculum that our students deserve. It is a part of our mission to aid and develop teachers committed to anti-racist, anti-bias teaching pedagogy and practices. Christie Nold, who goes with the pronouns she and her, teaches 6th grade at Frederick H. Tuttle Middle School, which rests on unceded territory of Abenaki peoples in South Burlington, Vermont. Christie also co-facilitates a graduate class on educational equity and serves as a co-advisor for her school's student organizing against racism collective. Prior to her time at her school, Christie led school programming at Shelburne Farms, a nonprofit dedicated to education for sustainability, and taught English and civic engagement at a village school in Ukraine. She is committed to teaching and learning in community and currently works less than 5 miles from her childhood home. In addition to local facilitation, Christie is an active member of Clear the Air, a Twitter chat led by Val Brown that is dedicated to exploring the intersection of anti-racism and public education. She is also a member of the Vermont Coalition for Ethnic and Social Equity in Schools and serves on the teacher advisory for National Geographic, and is a member of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation's Community Advisory Group. At this point, I want to turn it over to Tricia and Christie for their presentation on disrupting colonization in our classrooms. All right, Tricia and Christie, you want to take the screen? And then let's have you guys unmute, and I will mute.
All right, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Justin, for all your help in getting us started. We're really excited. So we are going to talk today about disrupting colonization in all of our classrooms. And I'm thrilled to be here with my good friend and wonderful educator, Christie Nold. We'll start with some brief introductions. Christie?
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you. My name is Christie. I use she, her pronouns and teach 6th grade here in Endakana, which is the unceded territory of Abenaki people in Vermont. I'm going to talk in a little bit more about that decision to teach just 5 miles from home that I discussed earlier, but am very excited to be with you all. One of the things that I love doing in my classroom is introducing text, and so I wanted to offer that I'm currently reading the young adult version of Just Mercy after having read the adult version and absolutely loving it, excited to bring it to my students and trying to think about the possibilities of possibly seeing some of the movie in theaters when it comes out.
Okay. And hello, everyone. I am Tricia Ebarvia, and I teach high school in southeastern Pennsylvania, the home of the Lenni Lenape people. I am currently reading, or I'm going to start reading, Ta-Nehisi Coates' newest book, The Water Dancer. I'm very excited after seeing him give a book talk this past week at the University of Pennsylvania, which is not too far from here. And we're just going to go ahead and get started with our next slide. So when Christie and I were envisioning this particular session, we were thinking about the ways that we can see colonization enter into our classrooms. And we wanted to start with this quote by Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And I'll just read it here for you. Berlin of 1884 was created through the sword and the bullet. But the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. The bullet was the means of physical subjugation. The language was the means of spiritual subjugation. I actually first read those words when I was in college, and I read his series of essays, Decolonizing the Mind. And it really stood out to me for a number of reasons. One, my own background. I'm Asian American, but identify as Filipino American. My parents immigrated to the United States from the Philippines in the 1970s. And for those of you who may know or don't know, the Philippines, of course, has been under various colonial powers for centuries. They were occupied by the Spanish for more than 300 years. And then the United States, of course, has had a long history in a sort of contentious relationship with the Philippines as a military base in Asia. And so when I think about my own growing up experience, and I think about the ways in which I have internalized some of the values of Western values through my own background, I think about this idea of language and learning as being this means of psychological subjugation, and the way that colonization has operated around the world, like in countries like the Philippines, but also how colonization then looks in the United States, and specifically how colonization in the United States takes on a new form, or I shouldn't say new form, but another form, which is settler colonialism, which is something that we are going to talk about. But I wanted to bring that up a little bit now because, again, I teach several books, one of them being Things Fall Apart, and my students and I talk a lot about how in that work of fiction, which is really an allegory by Chinua Achebe, that when the colonizers came to Africa, that they were not coming just with their religion, let's say. They were also coming with their schools. And it reminded me of the work that I've been doing with my students this year in thinking about the role of Indian residential schools and the role that the US government has played in that same kind of psychological and spiritual subjugation. So now I'll turn it over to Christie, who's going to unpack some of those terms a little bit for us too.
Thank you so much. One of the things that we wanted to share was that during this talk, we know that some of you are joining us live and others will be joining later. We'd love to encourage you to join in on the conversation for those who are on Twitter. You're welcome to join live alongside us, in which case we might be able to respond and interact with some of your thoughts. And for those who are joining later, we invite you to what's called slow chat, which means we still welcome your thoughts and ideas into the conversation. For those online, the first question we would love for you to engage with is, what is inclusion without a look at power? For those familiar with the Twitter chat format, you can simply write A1, your response to that question, what is inclusion without a look at power? And we invite you to use today's hashtag, the Ed Collab Gathering, hashtag number 5. So take a moment now to think on that question. What is inclusion without a look at power? Next. In my own life, Justin mentioned in the intro that I teach 5 miles from my childhood home, and that is an important and intentional choice Pictured here is Dr. Ruha Benjamin with her keynote address from the 2017 Roland Conference here in Vermont. In that address, Dr. Benjamin surfaced something really critical to our conversation today, which is the idea of the overserved. In many conversations about education, it typically centers a discussion of students we might call the underserved students. In many ways, again, bringing up a deficit frame of thinking in that some students are not receiving the education that they are owed and deserved in our country, a really important thing to surface. Additionally, if we were going to have a conversation about the underserved, Dr. Benjamin argues it's equally important to have a conversation of who then might be overserved. In my own educational experience as a white woman who grew up in Shelburne, Vermont, now teaching in South Burlington, I saw myself represented in my curriculum. I saw myself in the teachers who taught me in my school. I recognized that when my parents came together for conferences around the table, they were able to follow along with the conversations that were happening. In particular, my mom, who had also been raised in Shelburne and had attended the same schools that I did. And so in many ways, it could be considered that I was one of the overserved, an overabundance of reflection of myself and my curriculum, overrepresentation in text, and understanding that what responsibilities then do I have as an educator in the classroom to ensure that my students are seen in a more equitable way. For many of us who go into the field of education, it can be very easy to replicate status quo, especially for those of us for whom our educational systems worked. I had great teachers that I loved. I still love some of the texts that I read as a child. And it would be very easy for me to just continue to promote that style of education. What this conversation is asking me to do, and what many other conversations are calling for, is a level of reflection that requires an interruption of that status quo. Next. So I want to talk about this question that we asked you all to engage with online. What is inclusion without a look at power? Really, fortunately, there are many incredible scholars, educators, thinkers who are grappling with this question together with us today. One of those is Marian, an incredible math educator who has done a lot to look at the idea of what is at the center. Later, we'll share some links with you. The slide will be shared as well, and you can click right on the link that allows you into Marian's wonderful blog post in which she grapples with this idea of who and what is centered in the mathematics curriculum. What does it mean if in white spaces, in white schools, in white curriculum, mathematicians of color are, quote, included in the curriculum versus another way around, or versus creating a foundation upon which belonging exists? That idea of belonging is further explored by Hema in her piece, in which she and Marian come together to grapple with this idea of what it means to be an educator of color, a woman of color in mathematics today. And so in the sense, what does it mean to enter into spaces that are predominantly white? And when the folks at the helm of those spaces are saying, well, we've created inclusion, who is that we, and where does the power lie? The last example that I wanted to bring forward is that of Lydia Clemens, who does amazing work right down the road from me at her family's farm in Charlotte. The Clemens family farm is a Black-owned farm here in Vermont and has been for many years. As the family was thinking about what to do with the property today, and looked at the statistics around Black land ownership, Lydia recognized that she did not want her family to be one more statistic of a growing number of Black folks who have lost their land and lost their farms. And so it felt important at that time to hang on to both the land and the property and pieces that exist there. Now, what Lydia and her family has done is opened it up as this amazing African-American heritage site of culture, site of art. When I was there this summer for a wonderful class that was being led in cooperation with the Clemens Family Farm, the Flynn Center for the Arts, and the Abenaki Arts Association, Lydia asked us, those taking the course, this really important question around being in a Black-owned space. And what does inclusion look like when we have completely flipped the idea of the space? In many ways, our schools might still be considered white spaces. Public spaces, yes, but in many ways centering whiteness. And for that reason, Lydia was getting at this idea of where we are, whose land we're on, whose homes we're in, and what does it mean to include from another perspective. Next. That gets, for me, at this idea of reciprocity and relationship. And so thinking about power and inclusion, what does it mean to engage in relationship with one another from a more reciprocal place, from a place where we're coming together as peers within the conversation? Later, Tricia is going to be thinking more about the multiple layers to this conversation and multiple aspects of power in terms of getting at thinking about student voice, ownership of work. And so a question that I would posit as well is, when we are entering into right relationship with others, what does it mean to reflect upon ourselves and consider those power dynamics that are constantly at play? Next. Okay. So first, we were asking you to consider this question around inclusion and power. And now we want to dive a little bit deeper into the topic of this chat today. So we'd love for you to think about a couple of terms that are going to be central to this conversation: colonization and settler colonialism. In order to do this, we're hoping to surface some of the questions that you have about these terms. Know that we are following the chat on Twitter now, and so our hope is that some of your questions might continue to guide the conversation. So if you don't mind, take a moment now, again, answering using the A2 format. What do you know of the terms on the screen now? Colonization and settler colonialism. Next. To ground this discussion, we are using a piece from Eve Tuck's work around deepening understanding through a glossary of haunting. She shares, colonization is as horrific as humanity gets. Genocide, desecration, pox blankets, rape, humiliation. Settler colonialism, then, because it is a structure and not just the nefarious way nations are born, is an ongoing horror made invisible by its persistence, the snake in the flooded basement. In many ways, folks will often posit that colonization and settler colonialism exist in past tense, rather than as part of a continued project in the United States and on other land as well. When we recognize that this is a continued project, I believe it's easier to see ourselves, especially those of us who identify with dominant identities, as part of the settler colonial project that continues to persist on the land. It's important then that we recognize that not only are Indigenous peoples still a part of this land that we're on, so too is the project of erasure that continues to silence, to minoritize, and to push to the margins those that have always existed upon this land. And so when we talk about the role of colonization, both in the United States and abroad, we're thinking about those acts that have forced folks off their land, that have caused intentional, massive death. And we're also talking about that continued project of settler colonialism, in which, in many ways, we are still existing here in the United States on unceded occupied territory. In a moment, we'll talk a bit more about the idea of a land recognition and what it means to surface that and how we can go beyond and deepen that understanding of what that means. And yet it feels really important in this space to talk about the way in which this is a conversation deeply rooted in land and sovereignty. Next. So to that point, Eve Tuck really encourages folks to consider that decolonization is not a metaphor. It is not a word for injustice. It is not synonymous with anti-racism. Although these things are deeply connected and intertwined, it's critically important that decolonization not become one more buzzword in the way of equity, trauma-informed practice, and so many others, where it loses its particular meaning. And so in this case, it feels important again to surface the fact that decolonization is deeply connected to recognizing the indigenous peoples of this place and to really thinking deeply about the fact that this is unceded occupied territory, and ultimately moving toward a frame in which there is a clear discussion and ideally there is a sense of whose land we're on and a reconciliation process that has yet to take place in this country. And so important to name and surface the fact that that is not a metaphor for something else, although in this conversation, we are going to be bringing in components of active anti-racist pedagogy as well as others. Next. So what does that look like within the context of education? And in a moment, Tricia is going to dive into this much more deeply. But I wanted to mention just a few things to get us started in thinking about what does it mean to decenter or disrupt colonization within our class contexts. The first feels really important to surface, which is that people are not curriculum. People are also not a mascot. For those who are teaching in school buildings and in school districts with racist mascots, with mascots of other people, I might recommend that be the place to start, because I imagine that it is very difficult to be in right relationship with the folks who have lived and live on that land when that school community is tied to the racist mascot. So how then to bring in indigenous ways of knowing, and ways of thinking and frameworks into the classroom without simply making indigenous people a curriculum? One of the ways in which I've been fortunate to do this is working alongside Abenaki artist and educator Judy Dow here in Vermont, who has really helped me conceptualize of the land that I'm on in South Burlington, and also to think about different ways of knowing in my classroom. So for example, as we were talking about geography in the classroom and thinking about the cardinal directions, we also brought in a discussion of the directions of up, down, and inside, which are equally important to Abenaki people on the land. Next, shelves are only a start. And so we know that there's a continuum of text and perspectives, and Tricia is going to really dive more deeply into thinking about the way in which it's important to disrupt the text that we're using in our classroom, and also to go beyond thinking, I've done it, I've got the 5 books I need, and my work here is done. So how can we really deepen the conversation? In the same way, Dr. Debbie Reese, who I lean on so deeply for this work, encourages a really thoughtful approach to land acknowledgement. So what does it look like to acknowledge the land that we live and work on? And what does it look like to further think about that in the context of decolonization as it connects to Eve Tuck's work around thinking about land and sovereignty? And so not simply starting and ending with an acknowledgement, but really deepening that practice, which Tricia is going to share more about.
Thank you, Christie. Now we're going to move into sort of the second half of our talk today and think about how this really looks like in our classrooms. And to get us thinking about that, we have another question here that we'd love for you to think about and to tweet out if you can. In what ways have schools and classrooms reinforced colonial thinking and mindsets? So again, using, as Christie said, the A3 and the hashtag. Please consider this or write this down for yourself. In what ways have schools and classrooms reinforced colonial thinking and mindsets? And as you're thinking about that, we wanted to share with you this wonderful spoken word performance by George Yamazawa, Elizabeth Acevedo, and Pages Matam. While you are watching it, please pay attention or think about the lines in their poem that stand out to you, and we will return in about 3 minutes.
Teachers used to say, your behavior is just like your last name, unforgettable. In school, I learned a lot more about other people's names rather than the ones closer to my own, as if Madame Yamazawa Acevedo were so much harder to say than Tchaikovsky, Michelangelo, Eisenhower, like our last names were made of barbed wire, stripping the flesh of those trying to conquer the meanings in their mouths. See, my parents named me George, but honestly, I always hated the name George. It reminds me of some old dead bad white guy. Being a young, alive Asian boy, it was hard for me to make the connection. I realized my first name didn't match my background before I knew how to spell assimilation.
I always wanted a name that set the bar high, that tumbled out of mouths, somersaulted into a room and split the air. A name like Sochi or Anacaona, but although I must have punched inside the placenta, my parents decided on something placid.
Elizabeth.
A name for princesses, pampered women, and perfume. A name full of grace.
A name easily washed down with milk.
Patrick, meaning leader. Etymology, Irish. And although I speak French, I am from Cameroon. Bamileke et Douala, un lion indomptable. I would rather a name that will make a throat swell into a song rather than a sigh.
Your name is a song.
So now I call myself Pages so I can write my own story. It is the only name that I have ever owned.
And I wanted a name of Dominican Hills Rising and Campesinos Uprising instead of Long Live the Queen, but shorten my name to live so colonizers had less to hold on to.
You see, in Japan, your last name comes first. There's an emphasis on family. But in America, your nickname comes first because there's an emphasis on accessibility. Our parents had to dumb down our identity so our family could fit into a straitjacket society. On countless occasions, I've introduced myself and people would say shit like,
But what's your real name, though? That don't sound very ethnic.
you don't look like a George.
Or a Patrick.
And Elizabeth.
That's because my name wasn't given to me. It was given to the rest of the country.
Because when they hear names like George, Patrick, Elizabeth, what they hear is
Power, class, intellect.
So names like Piedemonte, Provanjane, Tatsunokochi sound like foreign, impoverished, illegal. What they hear is go back where you came from.
Your name is a dirt pit. It is a black hole. But what they don't know is that black holes be the brightest source of light.
I've always wished my name was dressed in chainmail, that it was a heavy name of thick thigh syllables shot down with short blades. So when I have my own children, I'm gonna name them something special.
Something to make people stumble on and guilt trip over.
Something to make their skin a little thicker than mine.
Something to remind their classmates of the last samurai instead of the first president.
Something powerful, something real ethnic, something unforgettable.
Okay, try to escape. Okay, there we go. All right, so as we looked at that, I'm hearing a buzzing. I hope you're not hearing that buzzing too, but as we looked at that particular poetry performance, which I love and I've shown to some of my students, I think a few things that stand out to me are some of the lines that I have up here on the screen. And as you read them and you think about the lines that stood out to you, one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that importance and that simplicity of a name. And I can't tell you how many students I have spoken to, many students of color and students from other marginalized groups who speak about how they became a different person when they were in school, literally having a different name because their teachers and their classmates could not pronounce their names. And I think about how our names are so central to who we are. It's the first identity that we have. And if we have children in our classrooms who are sitting there who feel as though they cannot bring that full self and that part of their home into the classroom, or it is being structured in a different way for the accessibility of others, what does that mean in terms of our practice? And I think about, again, when I look at my own stories, and so much of this work has to be personal, I think about even in my own family history, how when the Spanish colonized the Philippines, many Filipinos have Spanish last names. And it makes me wonder and think about, what were the last names that were lost? What were the family names that were lost? And what does that mean? And how can that be recovered? So I hope you think about that poem and perhaps revisit it. So when we think about how schools perpetuate the legacy of settler colonialism and colonization, we really have to think about power. And that was that first question, of course, that Christie shared with us. What is our positionality as teachers, as people who have power and authority in schools, who are really, especially if you are teaching in a public school, you are an agent of the state. To think about the gravity of that and to think about the language that we use. So one issue that we have that we must wrestle with is thinking of ourselves as saviors. I think many teachers go into teaching because they want to change students' lives. They want to give back to their community. They feel like they have something to contribute. I know that that is one reason why I wanted to go into teaching. But the problem is that sometimes we can fall into this trap of thinking of ourselves as being the ones to have the answers that will help kids, that we are the ones who, for example, are giving students a voice. I am a writing project person and I believe in writing workshop. And I can't tell you how many times I have said it and I've heard others talk about teachers needing to give students a voice. But if you just think about that language, giving students a voice, what are the assumptions behind it? What does it mean to give? Don't students already have a voice? And like the work of Dr. Jamila Lyscott, she comments that in her essay that students, they woke up like that. They had a voice. We did not give them a voice, but we gave them a space to be heard. And this idea of giving students a voice is also very paternalistic. And as we're talking today about settler colonialism and colonization, we have to wrestle with the fact that paternalism was one of the rationales for slavery and colonialism, that there were other people in power who felt they knew better than others, and therefore were going to dictate the way they spoke, the way they acted, and the way that they behaved even among their most intimate relationships with their family. Another issue of power, of course, is thinking about the teacher as expert. Because again, when we think about power, what and who defines expertise? What and who constitutes knowledge is rooted in colonial schooling traditions. And we can think about how, and I'll talk about this in a few moments, of course, the traditional canon, but we can think about how we might disrupt this top-down vision of learning by focusing on asset versus deficit-based pedagogies. Too often, I think that we see ourselves as having, again, this expertise. And while it's true that we may have some knowledge that maybe some students don't have, it's also true that our students bring with them to class every day fountains and rich resources of knowledge, and that we shouldn't only be looking at what they lack, because when we think about what they lack, we are making a judgment about what we have that they think we think that they need. So we think about decentering our power, repositioning ourselves as co-learners with students. This means being vulnerable. This means maybe saying that you don't have the answer. This means saying, you know what, I don't know, let's research this together. It also means that we have to think of ways to co-construct knowledge and to think about not just what that knowledge is, but also the forms of knowledge. When we think about our assessments, for example, our forms of assessments are conveying values all the time about the types of communication that we value in schools. But many times that is just a small slice or a small piece of how we can communicate. And our children have many different ways to communicate that are outside what is considered standardized or what standardized tests ask for. And we know this as teachers, but we have to think about the ways in which we are continuing to perpetuate the standard of knowledge on tests and other assessments by being complicit in that system. And in what ways can we perhaps disrupt that and challenge that? Another, as we return to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, another thing that he said in the same essay, the language of my education was no longer the language of my culture. And this is his reflection about his childhood experience going to colonial schools in Kenya, and how he had a rich life at home. But the moment he entered school, that is when he learned that that rich literacy life was not valued elsewhere. And even though he's writing this in 1990 about his childhood experiences in the 1950s, how much of this could be true for today? Think about how many students may walk into our classrooms and feel that what they bring is not valued, that the language of their culture, their spoken language, their body language, their way of knowing and being is not valued. And again, we can't really separate, or there's a deep connection, of course, we know, between settler colonialism, colonization, and white culture. And I want to build upon, bring in the work of Jones and Acuna on this idea of what is white culture and what are the things that are embedded, that are often invisible. And when things are invisible, that's how power works. So when we look at some of these bullet points here, which of these do you see embedded in the structure of schools and in our teaching practices? So that emphasis on individualism above all, competition. These first two especially, I personally see a lot in my own teaching, and I think in many high achieving and affluent school districts, this idea that, you know, that each person is sort of like out on their own and can get what they want. And if you think about individualism and competition, in many ways, these are the things that work against the kind of community that we want to bring in our classrooms. The idea of showing no emotion, or that when you become emotional, this is not somehow academic, and yet we are also human beings. The emphasis on linear thinking or perfectionism. And of course, as we know, the prioritization of the written word over all other forms of communication, and the quantity over quality. How might we see these things in our classroom? And I think if you're a teacher who's feeling a little defensive right now, looking at these, I have to ask myself, in what ways have I also promoted these lines of thinking, which are embedded with white culture? In what ways have I done this? And are there other ways I can think about how we can construct knowledge that does not depend on this cultural framework? And again, I'd like to bring back the work of Dr. Jamila Lyscott here. And when we again think about our communication, the work of silencing, shaming, and severing the linguistic and cultural practices of the home in an effort to have students adopt standard American English purported to be the language of power is the work of K-12 classrooms. So I think, you know, sometimes we think about grammar, things like grammar and conventions and style. As a writing teacher, I think sometimes we think about how these are just, you know, quote unquote, good forms of writing, and that we're just teaching kids what they need to learn in order to be successful in the world. That may be our intention, but we also have to recognize that that is also part of a long history of settler colonialism and colonization. So Dr. Lyscott suggests a few things. So first, to think about checking our own attitude towards the multiple language practices of our students. When our students come into our classrooms and they speak in a different way, or they may use different vocabulary or language, instead of seeing that as being not normal, or instead of saying that that's inappropriate, we have to think about, when we communicate that to our kids, are we saying their language is inappropriate, or are we saying that they are inappropriate? Because so much of language is part of who we are. So we have to be mindful of the ways in which we might be sending these kinds of damaging messages to our kids. And we also have to think about after years and years of being in the school system, students may have internalized those same attitudes from teachers and may be ashamed of their home languages or their multiple language practices. And then they therefore feel the need to code switch or not be their true authentic self. How can we put student voice over form above all, right? So instead of trying to sort of compress and make student voices fit into 5-paragraph essay templates, how do we really center what kids want to say in the way that best communicates that voice that they already have? I wanted to also include here a link to Dr. Lyscott's 3 Ways to Speak English TED Talk, which is another wonderful resource for teachers out there, for yourself, and also to bring to kids. It will spur a lot of great discussion about what we're seeing as far as what is considered valuable and different ways of communicating. All right, and of course our language, and when we think about language, our words convey value and truths. So how might our language reinforce colonizing mindsets? For example, when we think about Indigenous peoples, do we refer to them as only having existed in the past? As Christie opened earlier, she talked about how we often see colonization as an event thing that happened before, and now we've sort of moved beyond it, but this is an ongoing injustice that continues to today. Do we talk about Indigenous peoples as a monolith, right? Do we say people singular or peoples plural? And then also think about the language that we use. Do we call Indigenous stories myths, whereas we consider Genesis from the Bible something spiritual or literature? So these are, again, our messages that we're sending kids. And just recently, this actually happened last week when my students and I were going over a poem, and in the poem there was a line about the accent being the mark of an immigrant. And as students were walking around the room and they were writing next to that line, some students wrote, "We are all immigrants," and other students wrote, "Yes, yes," because they were agreeing. And I will say it for myself, again, I'm the daughter of immigrants to this country. I have to think about and wrestle with the fact that when we say we are all immigrants, we erase whole experiences of people. We erase people who are already on this land, whose land this belongs to. We erase people who are forcibly brought here through slavery, and we have to, or refugees. So this idea that we are all immigrants, while it can sound positive, it can sound welcoming, it can sound like this is like diverse, it actually is really problematic. And I also have to wrestle with the fact that as someone who is on this land now, that I'm also participating in that settler colonialism, right? To immigrate to this country to achieve my quote unquote American dream. But I have to think about the ways in which that is also part of this ongoing colonial project. So right now we'll just take a quick, well, we won't take a quick minute because I think we're a little bit short on time, but just think about what texts have been prioritized or elevated in school curricula. And I imagine that many of your lists will probably look something like this. This is actually from 1990, the most commonly taught novels, but we'll hazard a guess to say that many of these books are continue to be taught today. As I look at them, those are the books that I learned when I was in school more than 20 years ago. Many of those books are books I teach currently, and many of those books are on the curriculum of my own students, my own children's schools. But it's not just the decisions we're making as teachers. If you look at the Great American Read from PBS, which was last year, they asked viewers to vote on what would they consider the most, the Great American Read, however they defined it. And as you can see in this list, looking at that, just the top 10, how problematic just the top 10 is. Those of you who follow Disrupt Text know that we have many things to say about To Kill a Mockingbird, but even looking at number 6, Gone with the Wind, which I have always likened to sort of the Confederate monument of literature, that is something that's concerning. Not a single sort of non-dominant voice that is on that top 10 list. You have to go to number 27 to get to a book by a Black American writer, to 42 to get to The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, and to number 54 for 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Joy Luck Club and 100 Years of Solitude are also the only books by Asian and Latinx writers on that list of 100. And there are no Indigenous writers. So I often think about, when we think about disrupting the traditional white canon, many people feel a loss when there's this defensiveness about replacing some texts. There's this idea that some texts are essential, but who says what's essential? And in what ways can we think about where are our feelings of defensiveness and loss when we think about all the voices that have been marginalized and erased over centuries, right? Sometimes I wish all the energy that people spend towards defending Shakespeare or defending the Brontes or whoever it might be, where is that same enthusiasm or same energy or same passion for all the other voices that the canon has traditionally not included? So just a few quick things. This is available on my website, but just a few reminders here, because it's not just about including, like when Christie was talking about what do we mean by inclusion? It's not just about including text, because we have to think about, we can't have the 5 books from 5 different marginalized groups and now we're finished. We also have to think about, are we showing a diversity of voices within marginalized groups? Or are we giving kids, again, a monolithic view? We also have to think about the positionality of texts, right? Are all our whole class texts that are required still the traditional white male or even white female texts? And then all of the texts by, authors of color and Indigenous people, are those just relegated to choice texts, book club texts, or just in your classroom library? That's a step, but it is not real disruption when we're thinking about what does it mean to recenter our curriculum. We have to think about also censoring those counter narratives. I love a good pairing, but I think if you always have to pair a text by a Black, Indigenous, or person of color book with a traditional canonical text, again, what message does that send? Why do we need that traditional text in order to validate somebody else's voice? It's not necessary. And again, as we've been discussing here, not all oppression is the same. Anti-Black racism is different than, of course, settler colonialism and separate from colonization. And we have to make sure that we understand those nuances and that the harm and the issues facing people of color and Indigenous peoples is ongoing. The colonization was not an event centered on 1492, that it continues to today. And so again, when we're asking students to read and write and we're bringing text to them, we have to ask ourselves, what are we asking them to imagine? What are we asking them to rehearse? And to what extent do our teaching practices reinforce or disrupt colonial mindsets? And I think Christie was just going to chime in here very briefly with a few last words.
This summer at the Free Minds, Free People conference, there was an incredible plenary that really asked folks to explore and examine the role of the imagination. And in it, Dr. Ruha Benjamin talked about the danger of living in another person's imagination, and specifically, whose imagination are we living in? So recognizing the fact that enslavement was the result of a person's imagination, what harm is done when those imaginations are the ones within which we live. And so as we encourage our students to dive into texts, whose imaginations are we placing them into? And what could that mean for both their own humanity and our shared humanity together? A few other words to surface are those of Miriam Kaba, who encourage us to think about the way in which oppression actually puts a ceiling on our imagination, and Kwame Alexander, that thinks about the role of imagination for the child. Finally, I really want to call into the space the words of Adrienne Marie Brown, which is that we are trying to imagine a world that has not yet existed. A lot of the work that is happening now around decolonizing, disrupting anti-racism, it's in many ways an act of science fiction, as that is not yet what has been seen. And so how do we reach so far into the future that we can really imagine worlds that we haven't experienced? And for many Indigenous scholars, they might call us to equally reach far into the past and think about what had been here prior to colonization and prior to the settler colonial project.
Okay, and with that, we'll just leave you with this last question and to ask you to keep thinking about what have you done and what will you do to disrupt colonization in your classroom? Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. And Christie, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you so much, Tricia, and huge shout out to Justin, all of his help behind the scenes in making this happen. Thank you so much for all your support with these technical difficulties and everything else.
Thank you. We worked through it. Your presentation was well worth the wait. And thank you, Tricia. Thank you, Christie, for explaining and really framing the urgency of the work we all have to do to recenter and to take steps in trying to make sure we are decolonizing our classrooms. So thank you very much. A lot of buzz already on Twitter, and I look forward to furthering those conversations as we leave. So thank you one more time, Christie. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.